Good day and welcome to the first Barbados Genealogy Group presentation on Zoom. Today, Mr. Sabir Nakhuda will present the first in a three-part series on the Muslims of CARICOM, which is based on his book by the same name. His first book, Bengal to Barbados, was published in 2013. Sabir was born in Gujarat in India and came to Barbados at the tender age of 10. He received his primary and secondary education right here and went on to Canada for his tertiary education. Sabir will, however, describe himself as a Bajan Muslim. Sabir's interest in East Indian and Muslim heritage in Barbados and the Caribbean has not only produced 2 books, but has also seen him sharing his information with various audiences. Today, we are happy to welcome Sabir to this forum. But just before we hear from him, just a little housekeeping. You will find that some of our rules are listed to the right of your screen. But just to let you know, there will be a question and answer session after Sabir's presentation. And if you are interested in asking a question or making a comment, just indicate that interest by letting us know in the Zoom chat. We will then call on you when we are ready. So you keep your microphones muted until we indicate that you can speak. We will now turn the mic over to Mr. Sabir Nakhuda as he educates us on the Muslims of CARICOM. Sabir?
Let me greet everyone with the greeting of Islam. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. I wish to, first of all, thank Harriet and the Genealogy Committee for inviting me to speak on the topic of Muslims of CARICOM. I am an avid reader and student of history. Unfortunately, not much was written about the African Muslims in the Caribbean prior to the launch of my book, Muslims of CARICOM. The Barbados ambassador to CARICOM, Mr. David Commission, put it very well while writing the preface for my book. He stated that the story of Muslims of CARICOM was a story that has long been ignored, marginalized, distorted, and often even denied. He went on to say that how, for example, could Orlando Patterson, that eminent Caribbean scholar, write and publish his seminal work about the Caribbean slavery era and experience, the sociology of slavery, and not include a single reference to Islam or Muslim. And this is not to be unduly or singularly critical of Professor Patterson, for the sad truth is that this is a defect that is found in varying degrees in many, if not most, of the historical works written about the Caribbean. I thank God, therefore, for giving me the courage and determination I may speak on certain Caribbean countries and the experiences of those African Muslims. The religion of Islam first came to Africa in the early 7th century when a group of Muslims were sent by Prophet Muhammad, the progeny of African Hagar and Ishmael, when the adherents of the belief in one God were persecuted by the nobles to Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, as refugees. So Muslims first went to Africa as refugees. And then Islam later spread through trade, Islamic preachers, and some merchants from North Africa and the Middle East established centers in West Africa. And some of these centers became large cities such as Jenny and Timbuktu. Literacy flourished in West Africa, and the Songhai Empire was known for the Islamic University of Sankore, based in Timbuktu. Many African scholars and others from Muslim world came to this 14th century university to study the work of Plato and Aristotle, law, philosophy, astronomy, and many other sciences. In West Africa, a large percentage of Muslims were literate in Arabic and adopted many of the Arabic letters into their own languages. They were very keen on reading the Quran, and many of them memorized the Quran. The Quranic schools were open everywhere for Muslims, but also to non-Muslims. Some parents took their children from the marabouts. These marabouts are Muslim religious leaders during the Atlantic slave trade and enslaved the forefront of fighting against slavery. About 200 years prior to the invasion by Christopher Columbus, the West Indies, West African Muslims were undertaking transatlantic voyages with massive fleet of ships. Fadullah al-Omari, 1300-1349, recorded in his Masalik al-Absar that in 1312, the Mali Emperor Mansa Kita Abu Bakr Musa, Abu Bakr II, set sail from the Senegambia with 2,000 ships to discover the limits of the Atlantic, heading west across the Atlantic, never to return. Vincentian historian Edgar Adams, whom I had the honor to meet while I was doing my research in St. Vincent, stated in his book, The African Presence and Influence of the Cultural Tradition of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He wrote that he, Columbus, was informed by some Portuguese officials that African boats periodically left the Guinea coast and headed towards the land of the West with merchandise. Based on that knowledge, Columbus changed his course to sail back to the West Indies. Those black African seamen were later identified as Black Bunani. It has been suggested that the adventure of the Black Bunani seamen may have provided the first contact between the Africans and the indigenous Indians, the Arawaks and the Caribs, and that the relationship may have produced the first Black Caribs of St. Vincent. Not surprisingly, the name Garinago, used for the racial mixture of Africans and Caribs, and Garifuna, the culture, can be traced back to Mandinga and Islamic origin. The Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl proved that Africans had traded and exchanged cultures with people of the Americas. He built a 12-meter purpose boat which he named Ratu and set sail across the Atlantic from the port of Safi in Morocco and reached Barbados in 52 days on the 12th of July, 1970. So next month, July the 12th, will be 50th anniversary of the arrival of Ratu to Barbados. And I believe that we should have some sort of celebration to mark that particular moment in the history of transatlantic exploration. In many African societies, the enslaved were not treated as chattel slaves, but were considered as human beings with many privileges, sometimes even becoming military commanders and rulers. Walter Rodney stated in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he wrote, that at least up to the 17th century in Upper Guinea, there was no institution as slavery. It is also known that in southern Nigeria, as late as the 19th century, that there was no special word for the European term slave and master. The word used as equivalent was child and father. Between 1500 and 1866, approximately 15 million Africans were shipped to the Americas and the Caribbean. Over 20% perished during the long and turbulent Atlantic slave trade. The vast majority of slaves came from Western and Central Africa. Among them were a significant percentage of Muslims. These Muslims came from areas where Islam was present during the slave trade, such as Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mali, Benin, Ghana, and Nigeria, to name just a few. Among the Muslim tribes who were enslaved were the Mandingos, Mandinka, Mande, Fulani, Hausa, Nago, Mina, and Wolofs. The main purpose of the slave trade was to obtain laborers for the sugar, tobacco, and the cotton plantations that the Europeans were starting to develop in their various colonies. The indigenous people like the Taino Indians had been wiped out by disease and genocide. So they turned to Africa for cheap labor in the form of slavery. The significance of the African slave trade was that it disrupted the life of the entire continent and uprooted millions of people. It destroyed a cultural way of life that was superior to many of the cultures in Europe. It took the youngest, the strongest, the scholars, the ruling class, and all those who were capable of bringing the greatest benefit to Africa. Resistance to slavery started in Africa and continued throughout the entire period of enslavement. Most enslaved African Muslims in the Americas and Caribbean refused to adopt the culture and religion of their slave masters. They strived to retain, under the most severe circumstances, their religion, tradition, social and religious value, and Islamic identity. Although many of the African Muslims were Christianized under duress, they only outwardly show signs of the new faith, but secretly continue to adhere to their Islamic beliefs. They were, as Sylvia Diop, author of Slaves of Allah, but said, pseudo-converts. Richard Madden, who knew many Muslims in Jamaica, stated that very few Africans who had received Muslim education renounced their religion. Professor Sultana Afroz, who taught at the university in Jamaica, now presently retired and moved back to her homeland in Bangladesh, and who wrote a book called Invisible Yet Invincible. She wrote, forceful baptism of the enslaved Muslims on the plantation made them crypto-Muslims. In other words, secretly following Islam while publicly professing to be of another faith. Many in the guise of deacons in the less confirmed churches. Ironically, rebellions and revolts for emancipation came from these crypto-Muslims who disguised themselves as Christian deacons. The African Muslims had a very strong attachment to their religion, Islam, and to their holy book, the Holy Quran. In spite of their harsh conditions of slavery, they utilized various techniques to keep their knowledge of the Quran and Arabic alive. They used various means to acquire the holy book, and they seem to have had some success, as it is known that some Quran were in the hands of the Muslim slaves, including those in Jamaica and Trinidad. The Marabouts also had copies of the handwritten Quran. Benjamin Larton, a Mandingo enslaved in Jamaica, had written the Holy Quran from memory. Muhammad Kaba, another slave from Jamaica, also wrote the instruction on the performance of wudu, ablution, and prayers for other enslaved Muslims. There were many other knowledgeable Muslims who relied on their memories to ensure the continuation of Islamic education and the learning of the Holy Quran. One of the pillars of Islam is prayer, Salah. And although African Muslims were bondage, they made special effort to observe their prayers both individually and in groups. Professor Sultan Afroz writes, those crypto-Muslims used non-conformist churches in Jamaica, such as the Moravian, Baptist, and Wesleyan Methodist churches, which had an all-Black congregation. These venues became places of worship for Muslim slaves. They would come from various plantations to perform their prayer together. Excuse me. Fasting is the fourth pillar of Islam, but under certain circumstances, Muslims are allowed to abstain, as in the case of enslaved African Muslims. Despite not being obliged to fast, Many of them still chose to fast. G.H. Buckner, in his book, The Moravians in Jamaica, stated that even as they went through the process of baptism, they were in the habit of fasting thrice a week, eating and drinking nothing from sunrise to sunset. Although the African Muslims were in no position to give sadaqah or voluntary charity, they still shared whatever they had, money, food, clothing with others, other less fortunate slaves. African Muslim women would accumulate small quantity of rice, sugar, and other items from their rations to make rice cake or rice balls, as was done in West Africa and distributed as charity. That was a tradition in West Africa. The practice of sadaqah in the diluted form still continues to be observed in many parts of CARICOM, including Trinidad, Haiti, Grenada, and also among the Garinago people of Belize. It is now referred to as Saraka and is considered as a community restoring Thanksgiving rite. It allows an individual and community to receive the blessings of the ancestors by feeding the community, especially the children, who are considered the ancestors' representative on earth. During the Saraka celebration in the parish of San Andrew in Grenada, prayers are said before the food is served on a special leaf. Children would wash their hands and eat the food without any cutlery. Many African Muslims abstain from consuming alcohol. In the Honduras, or what you call now it is Belize, in the Honduras Almanac of 1838, Belize is not, Honduras is now Belize. Governor John Burton described the debauchery of slaves during the Christmas season when the forestry was closed. He wrote, the slaves came into township in Belize settlement, dancing, drinking, partying, and laying in the streets with the exception of the Mohammedans, who clearly behaved because of their Mohammedan connections and did not participate in any meat of the swine nor any spiritual buffets. Many African Muslims chose to follow the Islamic dress code. This included Imam John Muhammad Bath of Trinidad and Tobago, who always appeared in public dressed like that of a Muslim cleric. Another African leader, Samba Makumba, also from Trinidad, also wore a flowing white tunic. The enslaved Africans were given Christian names for their European convenience, but most importantly, to remove their African identity that were in their names. Despite this, the African Muslim held on to the names given to them in Africa. These Muslims' names can be found all over CARICOM, in the records of the plantation owners, deed registrar, and various other documents, as well as in the memories of former slaves and their progeny. Muslims named like Ayub, Ali, Sulaiman, Haida, and Fatima can be found in Haiti. Hamadi, Malik, Muhammad are among the Muslim names in Trinidad. In Jamaica, one can find names such as Abu Bakr, Haruna, Musa. Zamzam and Ali were the names of the Maroon leaders in Suriname. In Guyana, names such as Mahomet, Mahamadou, Hana, and Salah can be found in the Berbice official gazette. The African Muslim brought with them the knowledge of making amulets, as Grace Siga Diop in her book Servants of Allah writes. African societies used amulets for protection, but Islamic talisman from the start used a written word and are thus easily recognizable. Grace consists of a piece of paper on which the marabouts has written excerpts of a surah or a chapter of the Quran. The paper is then folded and sewn in cotton fabric or leather for preservation. Amulets are not object of worship. They are a medium through which one seeks divine help and protection. During the various slave rebellions, Islamic draperies were an integral part of the fighters' weapons. It was worn by the fighters to protect them from harm or death, and to crush their enemies in battle. Another form of resistance against the cruel institution of slavery was maroonage for the Africans to escape from the plantations and set up their own communities to freely practice their culture, language, and religion. The Maroon leaders were known and feared by all the white slave planters. The most famous of the pre-revolutionary Maroon leader was Swarmakandal. He was a Mandingo from Guinea, West Africa, and came from an illustrious Muslim family. He attended madrasa, where he studied Islamic knowledge along with Arabic language and memorized part of the Quran. He was a Marabou, he was an Islamic cleric, and was well known for his skills in amulet making. He also acquired a considerable amount of knowledge about tropical medicine. Makandal was sold as as a war captive and brought to Haiti to work on a sugar plantation. One day, while he was working on the sugar mill, his hand got caught and had to be amputated. He ran away to the mountains and chose the life of a Maroon. For 18 years, he was at large, delivering death and destruction upon the plantation. He organized a network of followers in the north and taught them how to make poison to kill the white slave owners. Michael A. Gomes wrote in his book, The Black Crescent, that Makandal was an orator equal in eloquence to the European orators of the day and different only in his strength and vigor. Makandal once delivered a speech to a secret gathering in the woods in the north. He used practical symbolism to explain his vision for Haiti by placing 3 different color handkerchiefs into a container. First, he pulled out a yellow handkerchief to symbolize the original Taino Indians who were exterminated by the Spaniards. Then he pulled out the second handkerchief that was white to symbolize the French currently in power. And lastly, a black handkerchief was pulled out from the container to represent they themselves who will remain the masters of the island. He predicted, Makandal predicted, that slavery would end and that blacks themselves will rule Haiti without the whites. Makandal led a 6-year rebellion from 1751 until 1757, which sought to overthrow the white regime. The rebellion left an estimated 6,000 dead. However, before he could fulfill his vision, he was caught and burnt at the stake on January 20th, 1758. About 30 years after the death of Makandal, the final uprising began with a moving speech by Duty Bookman. He was born in Guyana, just like Makandal, West Africa, and was a Marabou. He was also an Islamic cleric. Bookman was a man of the book, and that book which he carried with him was the Quran. He was captured and brought to Jamaica during many slaveries in West Africa. He was sold to Haiti because of his many protests against the inhumane and barbaric treatment of the slaves in Jamaica. As a slave, he rose to a rank of a coachman, which allowed him to travel from plantation to plantation. He had a very charismatic personality that allowed him to build a network of followers in the north. On the night of the August 14, 1791, Imam Bookman gathered a large assembly of slaves in a clearing in the forest called Bois Ki Imam, which translates to woods by the Imam's house. Also present at the ceremony was a Muslim lady by the name of Fatima, who was the daughter of an African woman and a Caucasian man. Bookman launched his revolt with a speech in Creole, which N and R Heine translated in the book Written in Blood. And I think that I should really read it in English. He said, "Good Lord, who hath made the sun that shines upon us, that riseth from the sea, who maketh the storm to roar, and governeth the thunders, the Lord is hidden in the heavens, and there is he watcheth over us. The Lord seeth what the blanks have done. That's a derogatory term for the whites. Their God commandeth crimes, ours giveth blessings upon us. The good Lord hath ordained vengeance. He will give strength to our arms and courage to our hearts. He shall sustain us, cast down the image of the God of the blanks, because he maketh the tears to flow from our eyes. Hearken into liberty that speaketh now in all your hearts. By the way, Bukman was not a voodoo priest. He was a Muslim cleric. Word spread rapidly of this historic gathering, so the Maroons and slaves prepared themselves for the major assault on the whites. The whole of the northern plain were in flames, with hundreds of sugar and coffee plantations being destroyed. Hundreds of plantation owners were killed, and the women raped. In November 1791, Bukman was shot dead by an officer, and his severe head was fixed on a pole and placed on display in a public square in Cape Francois. Sidva A. Diop, the author of The Servants of Allah, summarized the role played by Makandal, Bukman, and the Muslims in the Haitian Revolution. There is thus, she wrote, there is thus the compelling evidence that the two major leaders in Haitian Revolution or Haitian history, Makandal and Bukman, were not only Muslims, but also marabouts, Islamic clerics. They were not the leaders of Muslims. They did not embark on the jihad, but they were the leaders of the slave revolution. Irrespective of religion, what they provided was military expertise, occupied with spiritual and occult assurances that the outcome of the fight would be positive. Both skills were extreme value, each of its own, but together they conferred on these leaders the aura of mythical figure. Because of their marabout knowledge, they would galvanize the masses, push them to action, and to surpass themselves. She went on to say other marabouts and the Muslims in general played a crucial role in the Haitian revolt and ultimately in the Haitian Revolution through their occult skills, literacy, and military traditions. The marabouts provided protection to the insurgents in the form of grace, and the Muslims used Arabic to communicate during the uprisings. Though their role and contribution have not been acknowledged, the Muslims were essential in the success of the Haitian Revolution. The prophecy of Makandal was later fulfilled. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines proclaimed Haiti's independence. The impact of the Haitian Revolution was profound. It propelled other slave leaders, including the one in Barbados, to revolt in many parts of the Caribbean and Americas, and was instrumental in the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Captain Powell brought 10 slaves to Barbados in 1627, and later slaves were brought from various parts of Africa, but their ethnic origins are not well known. Sir Hilary Beckles, in his book entitled A History of Barbados, writes, tracing the ethnic origins of Africans in Barbados society, as elsewhere, is complicated by the fact that most information on the slave trade has related to the port of departure rather than the catchment area from which the persons originated. In addition, planters and slave traders alike simplified the slave trading world of West Africa, and in the process lost much of the detail concerning special aspects of ethnicity. Jerome A. Candler and Jacoby in their work Slave Names and Naming in Barbados, 1650 to 1830, are of the view that the great likelihood that slaves use plantation names among themselves has important implications for the study of slave names in general, since the overwhelming majority of these names were never recorded by plantation authorities. They are absent from historical records. It is therefore possible that among the enslaved Africans in Barbados, There were many Muslims, especially those who spoke Arabic and had Muslim names. So we had Muslim, enslaved Muslims in Barbados. An incident is recorded by a Moravian author that on Mount Tabor plantation in St. John, there was an African slave named John Adamson, who was the son of a tribal king in Africa and who spoke Arabic fluently. In the slavery register of Barbados, one will repeatedly come across the name Sambo. And as we know, Sambo is really a derogatory term. On Codrington Plantation alone, Codrington Plantation now is a Codrington College, there were about 10 West African slaves with the name Sambo, yet no mention is made of their ethnicity or religion. Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, historian and lecturer who visits Barbados very often because his grandmother is a Bajan. In explaining the word Sambo, said that many Fula speakers pronounce the Tamba as Samba, which later was pronounced Sambo with the pressure of the Atlantic slave trade, destruction of the African language and culture. Therefore, any slave whose name have a name Sambo was probably of Fulani origin and is a Muslim. The name Samba can mean a second son in the language of the Hausa or Fula. Author Travis Glasson in his book Mastering Christianity writes that given the West African origin of much of Codrington's plantation, many of the slaves would have been familiar with Islam, and some may well have considered themselves Muslim. He went on to state that among the enslaved people living on Codrington in 1740s were a woman and a girl named Fatimur or Fatima. And by the way, Fatima was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace. Also among the enslaved people living in the estate in the 1740s were men named Yassan and Hassan. Hassan again was the name of Prophet Muhammad's grandson. Names that also may have had Arabic roots. On November 29, 2015, the Nation newspaper carried an article headlined Hills Saved Slave Burial Ground, where it stated the Newton slave burial ground dates from around the 17th century, while mass burial there probably took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. More than 100 bodies were discovered, some buried facing east, indicating they were Muslim. This shows that the presence of the enslaved African Muslims in Barbados. As I said earlier, the resistance among the Africans began from the time they were captured and took many forms. There were aborted rebellion in Barbados in 1649, 1675, and 1692. But the revolt of 1692 was well planned, organized, and kept secret for years. The four men who were the most prominent in the revolt were Haman, Ben, Samson, and Samba. The revolt failed. The four ringleaders, along with others, were executed. 104 years later, there was another revolt in Barbados, known to many as Bassa Uprising or Bassa Revolt. The uprising was short-lived, and within 4 days it was crushed. Bassa or Busso is considered to be the prominent member of the rebellion and is our national hero. But unfortunately, there is very little information known about Basso or Bussa. Renowned historian Henry Beckers in his Bassa, the 1816 Revolution in Barbados writes, excuse me, it is reasonable to suggest that Bassa was a member of the Bassa Nation, a faction of the powerful ruling Mande people who during the 14th and 15th century had spread over much of West Africa as traders and conquerors. The Mande had brought Islamic culture to the Hausa in what is now northern Nigeria. But the Bassa people had settled at the crossing of the Niger and the famous southwest trading route from Hausa, Castina to Ashanti. The Bassa traded in both gold and cola within the region, and particularly with the Portuguese at Alamina. The route from Niger to Bandalan was used mainly by traders. and commercial and political prominence of the Bassa people emerged within this context. It has been suggested that the town of Bassa was probably a center of the Mandé ruling group who established the ancient and famous town Oyo and Benin in the southern Nigeria. The Bassa people, therefore, were a ruling people who were well known as traders and administrators. It is reasonable also to suggest that Bassa would have brought to Barbados these developed characteristics of his people. From my own research, I have learned that Islam had first come to Africa in the early 7th century, when a group of early Muslim refugees were sent by Prophet Muhammad. Later, Islam was spread to West Africa through the activities of the Muslim merchant traders. They made the spread of Islam an important part of the activities in West Africa. Most of the Mandé groups in the western parts of West Africa have been predominantly Muslims as early as the 13th century, and among many related ethnic groups include Bassa and Mandinka. Sheikh Adam Abdullah Al-Lori, 1917-1992, was a leading Benin Nigerian Islamic scholar who opined that it was during the period of Mansa Musa of Mali, 1337, that Islam spread to most parts of Nigeria, including Yoruba land. It is likely there were Muslim traders from Mali who came to Old Oyo and spread Islam there. It is therefore more likely that Bassa was a Muslim. However, further research is needed to learn more about Bassa and his African roots, and I think that all historians should make a special effort to find out more about our national hero Bassa. In the Caribbean, African Muslims were in the forefront in fighting injustice, oppression, and tyranny of the evil system of chattel slavery. It was no different in Barbados, with Samba as one of the leaders of the 16 aborted revolution, and Little Samba of Adventure Plantation martyred during the 1816 revolution, along with General Bassa. In 1797, Trinidad was captured by the British. An ongoing slave trade brought many African laborers to the island nation. They were brought from Senegambia region. They were Hausa, Nupe, Fula, Mandingo, Igbo, and Yoruba, and others that made up the Muslim slave population of the island. The slave masters changed the names of the slaves to Christian names. There was also the French slave laws, the Code Noir, which required that slaves should follow the tenets of the Roman Catholic faith. The West Indian Regiment was a British infantry regiment formed in 1795 to defend the British West Indian Islands during the Napoleonic Wars with France. David Trotman and Paul Lovejoy in their book Community of Believers stated that a significant minority of the soldiers in the regiment were Muslims. In a sample of 745 soldiers recruited between 1798 and 1808 for the 5th Regiment, whose ethnicity indicated perhaps 24% were Muslims. The 3rd Regiment could conceivably have had more Muslims, since many seem to have been taken off a ship from Bight of Benin. There appeared to have been a number of Hausa on board on these ships, and while they were dispersed to various colonies, many of them went to Trinidad. In the years after the cessation of hostilities, these West Indian units were gradually disbanded. Hundreds of soldiers were settled in Trinidad, about 340 from the 3rd Regiment alone. Some of the troops from the disbanded regiments were then settled in the wilderness of northeastern Trinidad on the bank of perennially watered Hondo River in the Creary region of Valencia and Manzilla. Many of them were born in Africa and were Muslims. They wanted to live separately from the Christians so that they could practice their Muslim faith. 8 acres land were given to each person, and 16 acres were of land were given to the families. These Muslims planted a variety of crops, including rice, yams, plantain, ginger, corn, coffee, and cocoa, sold at the nearby Rima market. Muslim community of Trinidad was led by Yunus Muhammad Bad. He was born in Senegambia between the Senegal and Gambia rivers. He was a Muslim from a privileged family and as a youth had received Islamic education and was literate in Arabic. He was well versed in the Quran and carried a copy of the Quran with him. Bath was caught by the slave traders around 1805 and brought by the British traders in Trinidad. In Trinidad, he swore on the Quran, the copy which he carried with him, that he was a prince in his native country, Gambia. The British authority observed that Yunus Bath was a man of rank among his people. So when the war broke out between France and Britain, Governor Hislop was determined to defend the island. He used labor to hastily, he used slave labor to hastily build Fort George and put Yunus Bath in charge of the slaves, a task which he carried out efficiently. By 1812, Bath achieved his freedom and was appointed magistrate over his fellow Mandingo Muslims. The Muslim community in Trinidad strive to live their lives and solve their disputes on the basis of Islamic Sharia. Thus, Yunus Bath assumed the responsibility of a judge, adjudicating cases on the basis of religious or secular law as required. Yunus Bath also organized the Muslims into a society where the Muslims who were involved in commercial activities as hucksters and traders could borrow from the society to finance their commercial and agricultural ventures. Apart from assisting its members with their commercial and agricultural activities, the major objective of the Muslim community was to use the society's fund to buy the freedom of their fellow Muslims, so that part of the earnings from trading as well as agricultural profits can be used for the purchase of individuals' freedom. The free individual would then work out an arrangement with the society to repay the money. Based on reports published in the British parliamentary papers suggests that between 1808 and 1834, about 2,956 manumissions were granted in Trinidad, and as many as 500 of these were Muslims. By August 1st, 1834, when the British Emancipation Decree came into force, Bath was able to boast that few, if any, of his countrymen were still enslaved. Although the Muslims were prosperous in Trinidad at the end of the slavery in 1834, they wanted to return to their home in Africa. On 3 separate occasions between 1831 and 1838, Yunus Bath and the community sent written petition calling on the British government to help them return to their homes in Africa. There were 12 petitions. We cannot forget our country, they wrote. Death alone can take us to that. Michael A. Gomes, in his book, Black Crescent, aptly described their feelings. He wrote, the Trinidad African Muslim community registered a definitive rejection of the Western civilization, in that they wanted neither Western religion nor life under Western authority. Having achieved positions of advantage in Trinidadian society, they nevertheless prefer the culture and civilization of their West African homeland. Perhaps this refusal of assimilation into European cultural mode represent the ultimate revolt against slavery and colonialism. Michael Gomes again summarized the position of the Trinidadian Muslim community. He wrote, while the Islam introduced by the Africans will eventually go into eclipse in Trinidad, the fact remains that the African Muslims' presence there constitutes one of the largest, most organized, most vibrant, most enduring of and influential African communities in all of the Americas prior to the 20th century. Perhaps rivaled by their co-religionists in Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabir. I think we can all join on saying a good thank you to Sabir for educating us about the Muslims of CARICOM, especially about the Muslims who would have been part of that enslaved community from which we are all descended. We are now going to open the floor for questions and answers. You just have to indicate your desire to ask a question or to make a comment, and we will unmute you. So just indicate in the Zoom group chat if you're interested in making a submission. Okay, it seems as though persons understood fully what was said. Okay, we have a question from Bob. I'm just trying to find you. Bob, you can unmute your, oh yeah, there you are. Just unmute your
Can you hear me now?
question.
Well, first of all, let me say thanks very much, Ms. Nakhuda, for your outline. What I found very interesting is that you gave a very historical concept of African Muslims and their role in the Caribbean. First of all, I must say, you remember I visited you a couple of years ago with Professor Dabedin. We came to see you.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Glad to see you once again.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, I'm sitting in lockdown in the UK at the moment. So now the outline you gave about Africans, have you got any information like up to date now? How did the Muslims from the South Asian continent, and what are their presence in CARICOM? Because the outline you give is predominantly from slavery to the present day and that African retention. What's the impact of South Asian Muslims in CARICOM?
Thank you for your question. This book, Muslims of CARICOM, is very comprehensive with the presence of the Muslims in the CARICOM region. I wrote about the 15 CARICOM countries. And so today's lecture is only based on the arrival of the African Muslims to the CARICOM region.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, God willing, my next lecture would be, the second lecture would be based on the arrival of after the end of slavery, as you know, in 1834, there was the need for the labor to work in the plantation, sugar plantation, and so on. And so then they went to India and bring the indentured laborers from India, from north of India, from West Bengal and Tamil Nadu and so on. So my next lecture, God willing, will be based on the arrival of the indentureship, arrival of the East Indians as indentured laborers, mostly dealing with the Muslims from that continent.
Okay, thanks.
And
sorry.
what did they do? What role did they play? How did they establish themselves in a new environment? How did they practice their culture? How did they practice their religion and things like that? I will be dealing with that, God willing, in my next lecture. So I will have more than one lecture, maybe 3 or 4 lectures. So I have just divided up these lectures into series.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sabir. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments. Okay, So I just want to thank you all for tuning in to our first Zoom session. Okay, before we before we have a brief presentation of the book, Sabir's next presentation, the second part of this three-part series, will be in August. However, in July next month, we will be having Professor Pedro Welch, who will be looking at the myths around genealogical research. If you remember, Sabir mentioned Jerome Handler's work on names and naming. And one of the misconceptions is that all surnames derive from plantation owners. So this, among other myths, will be debunked by Professor Welch in his talk in July. I will let you know the exact date and keep you informed. If you are not on our mailing list, you can just send in an email or mention or send your email to the chat and we will add you to our mailing list. So I just turn over to Sabir now for a brief presentation. Okay, well, Sabir just presented a copy of his book, Muslims of CARICOM, which will be added to the library's collection here at the museum. So again, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Join us again in July for the presentation by Professor Welch, and in August for the second part of Sabir's three-part series. I thank you and stay safe, everyone. Bye.